For a myth like the myth of Achilles, something so grand and epic, this book actually feels very empty. Patroclus didn't seem to have any personality of his own. He kind of reminded me of Bella's swan in Twilight. And I think Odysseus's line is, "Let it be known that I tried." And I was like, well, yeah, that should be the motto of this book. Let it be known that Madeline Miller tried. Hello and welcome to Wrapped in Books. My name is Pega, I'm an author, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This book is a retelling of the myth of Achilles, one of the most famous heroes and warriors in Greek mythology. I'm from Iran, I write fantasy books based on Persian mythology, but I do have some basic knowledge of Greek mythology. I know the gods, the goddesses, the hero. I hadn't heard anything about this book before reading it. I hadn't read any reviews. The only thing I knew was that it was a retelling of the famous myth of Achilles and that there was a romance between Achilles and Patroclus, who is another famous warrior in Greek mythology. Even though I didn't have very high expectations before reading this book, I was still left disappointed, and in this review, I will explain why. I am going into a deep dive and discuss details about this book, so spoilers ahead. If book content and book reviews is something that you're interested in, please consider subscribing to my channel so that you wouldn't miss the future videos. Now, without further ado, let's wrap ourselves in this book that is called The Song of Achilles. The Song of Achilles is the retelling of the myth of Achilles, but without any of the interesting aspects that made the myth so popular in the first place. This book is surprisingly uneventful for a book that is inspired by Greek mythology. One thing that everyone knows and agrees about Greek mythology is that whatever it is not boring. There are so many interesting characters in Greek mythology. The ferocious gods, the scheming goddesses, the lucky and the unlucky heroes, doomed romances, hot romances, unlikely alliances, betrayals, backstabbing, all of that you can find in Greek mythology. There are so many ways you can retell a Greek myth in the modern age. And I think sadly Madeline Miller chose probably the worst way possible. The Song of Achilles is a love story between Achilles and Patroclus, who in the myth is a close companion to Achilles. In this version, Achilles and Patroclus are to share a passion that is not necessarily rejected in the Greek society, but it's definitely not considered desirable. Other than the romance trope that we have in this book, there is no level of depth to the story at all. If you're looking for a book that covers some interesting aspects of Greek mythology, this is not going to satisfy you. There is no scheming, there is no political twist and turn, and there are no epic battles. There are a couple of battles, especially towards the end of the book, but they are described very vaguely as well. One of the main issues of this book, I think, is pacing. The pacing is all over the place. I was reading this book on a Kindle, and up until 70% of this book, almost nothing happened. And then at the last 30% mark, things start to happen all at once. Before you get to the 30% mark in the end, the book is actually very boring. This book is single POV. The story is narrated from Patroclus's point of view. And it's clear that this book was in desperate need of a couple of more POVs. The first person point of view is limited. It doesn't help because Patroclus as a character is not very interesting at all. If you're going to have a first person point of view, you have to at least have a character whose life is exciting. That is sadly not the case for Patroclus. For a myth like the myth of Achilles, something so grand and epic, this book actually feels very empty. I was under the impression that this is a fantasy book, and that's how it's marketed as well. I think actually fantasy is the first genre that when you search the book comes up. But I found very few fantastical elements in this book. And even those were so sparse and vague that I have a difficult time calling this book a fantasy at all. There is mentions of gods and goddesses here and there, and we get to see them a couple of times, but that's it. Both Achilles and Patroclus are kind of flat and one-dimensional. I didn't think they had any sort of chemistry. Even if you consider the main focus of this book to be the romance between these characters, I would say that the romance is very weak. I also wasn't the biggest fan of the writing in this book. It's one of those flowery prose that I don't usually like. And though beaks and claws and teeth and coils and stinging tails would flay him, I mean, this almost sounds like a limerick. There were a few times where it was mentioned that the characters were eating fish and lemons, and I found that a bit strange. I wasn't expecting to read about lemons in a retelling of the myth of Achilles. Also, pomegranate as a fruit was mentioned a couple of times, and that was strange because pomegranate is a Persian fruit, not Greek. There were times when the writing attempted to sound profound and ancient, and then there were times that the writing sounded really modern. The inconsistency of the language, I think, was apparent throughout this book. Patroclus says, "I'm sorry," so many times in this book that I've lost count. Almost every time he was talking to a character, he either started the conversation with "I'm sorry" or ended it. This happened so frequently and it quickly became repetitive. The thing is, having a character that constantly apologizes is not characterization. Patroclus is a young prince who accidentally kills the son of a noble at the age of 10. According to the law, he must be exiled, so he goes to Achilles' father's castle to live the rest of his life, and it is there that they meet. There is immediately a spark between them that they both try to deny at first. Achilles is a demigod, like the myth. His mother is Thetis, the famous goddess of water. I was really disappointed by the characterization of Thetis. She was barely even a character in this book. I was hoping to see more of her. She just shows up from time to time to express concern for Achilles and her hate for Patroclus. She's supposed to be this immortal being, this mighty goddess, and she comes across as a disapproving mother-in-law. I didn't find her intimidating or imposing at all. She also does nothing to drive Patroclus away from her son, even though she apparently hates his guts. She once sends Achilles away, but then Patroclus finds his way back to him quite easily. And then when they get to a place, we're told that the goddess cannot see them in there. And I was like, okay, well, that's convenient. It would have been fine if Achilles and Patroclus used their wit to ditch the goddess. I could have read a whole separate story about that. Two young people who want to be together, but they can't because of this mighty goddess. So they try to defy her will and find clever ways to be together. That would be an interesting story. I would have liked to read a book about that. Now, about Patroclus's character. He has almost no agency throughout the story. He's portrayed as weak, timid, and basically devoid of personality. For the majority of the book, he just follows Achilles everywhere like a lost puppy. Like, he doesn't even know what to do with his life when Achilles is not around. He keeps admiring Achilles' appearance, his physique, his feet, which was odd because this book doesn't really do the famous myth of Achilles' feet. I don't know why Patroclus keeps mentioning how beautiful Achilles' feet are. It just sounded to me like he had a foot fetish. Patroclus didn't seem to have any personality of his own. Every time he was separated from Achilles, his only thought was to get back to him. And I was like, well, find some hobbies, find some other friends, get to meet some other people, live your life a bit, grow as a person, make something of yourself. He doesn't do that. He's just fixated on getting back to Achilles. And that's it. He doesn't seem to have a separate identity from Achilles. Patroclus is very much like a blank slate for the readers to project themselves onto. And it's funny, but he kind of reminded me of Bella Swan in Twilight. Bella Swan in Twilight is also, deliberately stripped of her personality so that every young girl who's reading the book can project themselves onto her. And Patroclus in this way reminded me of Bella Swan. And that is really not the type of character that I like to read about. Even though this is supposed to be a queer romance between two male characters, Patroclus and Achilles, Patroclus very much read like a female character and not the best female character as well. Those female characters that, are in constant need of attention and saving and protection. He's small, fragile. Achilles constantly has to reassure him that he will take care of him. And I didn't like how he was portrayed this way, especially because Patroclus in the myth is a very skilled warrior himself. What I would have liked to read about was two characters that were equal to one another, who competed for fame and glory while also pursuing a romantic relationship. I was expecting a competitive spirit between the two. Some clever banter, some lover spat, some challenges that they needed to overcome in their relationship. But nothing like that really happened. I didn't really understand what Achilles found attractive about him at all. There are chapters, especially in the first part of the book, where nothing happens. And then we get sentences like, 2 years had passed, or we were 15, or it was spring again. So it felt like time was just passing without anything happening. Now, we all know that the Battle of Troy happens over a decade. In the myth, it takes 10 years for the battle to actually come to an end. In this book, it also takes 10 years for the battle to end. But I think that was the wrong choice. I think Madeline Miller should have taken a different course with this one, because the time that the characters spend at the war camp is actually very boring. Nothing interesting or exciting happens there for almost a decade. You just have characters waiting for something to happen, and also we are waiting for something to happen. That is a very long wait without much payoff in the end. If you're writing a retelling of the myth, you can also change that fact. You can change how many years the Trojan War actually lasted. It doesn't have to be 10 years if you don't have a story to actually fill the space. During those 10 years, we just have characters spend time in a war camp, facing plague, some battles that we don't get to see, some women that are captured and brought to camp. Some things happen, but really none of them are that interesting or that deep. For example, there's a mention that because they had been camping there for so long, they suddenly started occupying the land. So instead of visitors, they became occupants. How something like this happens is a subject worth writing a book about. But then again, Miller just, brushes over this so easily. Patroclus as a character is only fascinated by Achilles, and he doesn't really pay much attention to everything else that is going on around him. When I read the book, I went on Goodreads and I read some reviews. I realized that a lot of people in their 1-star or 2-star reviews mentioned how women are portrayed in this book. I can understand why. I understand that this doesn't translate well to modern women especially, but it's also something that is true for the time that the story is being retold. We all know how women were treated in the past, especially at the time of war. But I still would have liked to see more agency for women. There is only one other female character in this book that Achilles and Patroclus meet when they're camping behind Troy's walls. She does have some characterization, but I think she still had potential to be a more fleshed out character. I must say, one thing that I noticed about the treatment of women in this book and was really disturbing to me was what happens between Patroclus and Achilles' wife. Achilles, before going to war, gets married to a princess. The princess finds out that Achilles is actually in love with Patroclus. One day, she brings Patroclus to her chambers while she's pregnant with Achilles' child, and they have sex together. Why? I don't know. Maybe the princess wanted revenge. Maybe she wanted to find out why Achilles was fascinated with this man so much, which was also my question. But why did Patroclus do it? I was thinking, okay, maybe this is going to alter their relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. But it doesn't. It doesn't have any effect in the story at all. It's just a very, very disturbing scene to read. The woman who's pregnant with Achilles' child has sex with Patroclus. I don't know. I don't like that at all. Also, when Patroclus and Achilles have sex, it is written this way: "He went still as I took him in my hand, soft as the delicate velvet of petals." I am so tired of romance writers describing penises as velvet. You have got to find other things. We have had enough velvet steels, velvet petals, velvet shafts. I have read them all. Please find another thing, anything else other than velvet. Patroclus in this retelling is actually kind of a pacifist. He doesn't like war. He doesn't like to kill people. He actually likes to save lives, which is what he learns to do when Achilles is training to become a warrior. Patroclus instead decides to learn medicine and surgery especially. That was okay because he had some sort of an agency. We don't even get to see how he learns it and how he feels about it. Yes, he likes to save lives, but still, doing surgery for a person who doesn't like violence must be a challenge. But we don't get to see that because we have to hear Patroclus compliment Achilles' golden skin. Anyway, then he gets to the war camp. I was thinking, okay, so this, medicine thing is going to come back into play. And it did, but not in the way that I was hoping for it. Again, he doesn't really suggest to help the wounded. Someone else sees him and they're like, if you want to help, go to that tent. That tent is the place where they treat the wounded and the ill. And I was like, well, why? Just give this character some agency. Why doesn't he volunteer for this? He's trained for it. Why do we have to have another character suggested to him? There is one interesting aspect in this book, and that is defying fate. We understand from reading the book, and this is in the myth as well, that Achilles' fate is tied to Hector, Prince of Troy. So we know that Achilles kills Hector, and when he does, the prophecy says that he's also going to die. Achilles' mother tells him about this prophecy, and we see that throughout the book. He kind of tries to tiptoe around the prophecy. He tries to live his life in a way that the prophecy wouldn't become true. He also doesn't really want to fight Hector in any way. He tries to stay away from him because he knows that if he kills Hector, it is likely that he's going to die as well. This I liked. I think this is an interesting conflict. It wasn't really fleshed out and it wasn't really explained well in the book, but it was a theme that I enjoyed nevertheless. Fighting fate is something that I always find interesting, especially if the character is able to find clever ways to change the prophecy. Achilles, sadly, in this book, doesn't manage that. He kind of falls into the prophecy in the end, like the myth. Hector in the myth kills Patroclus, and Achilles kills Hector for revenge. Achilles in this book is also kind of a douche. I mean, I know that he's also arrogant in the myth, but in this version, he was more of a douchebag. There weren't many layers to his character. I think Achilles and Patroclus in this book are quite boring, honestly. And I don't know how that's possible because they're both very famous mythological figures, and there are many great stories around them. The Trojan women in this book also don't have a prominent role. We don't even get to see them. We just hear their names, and that's it. Because again, we have only Patroclus' point of view. And as I mentioned before, his point of view is not that wide or that interesting. We realize in the end that because Achilles is in the underworld and Patroclus' spirit is still wandering the earth, they still cannot be together. The last line of this book was actually, I think, quite cheesy. It is said that two people hold their hands in the underworld and the light erupts or something like that. And I was like, okay. Odysseus is also present in this book, but surprisingly doesn't have much presence at all. Odysseus in the actual myth is a complicated character. He's a complex man with personal interests and motives. He almost plays the most important parts in the Trojan War. Again, because we don't have any of the interesting aspects of the Trojan War in this book, Odysseus' character as well becomes kind of irrelevant. In the end, he just talks to Agamemnon for a little bit because Patroclus' spirit asks him to, and Agamemnon just says no to his request, and that's it. And I think Odysseus' line is, "Let it be known that I tried." And I was like, well, yeah, that should be the motto of this book. Let it be known that Madeline Miller tried. Okay, so that's a wrap for today. That was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Have you read this book? What are your thoughts on it? Write your opinions down in the comments for me. Please like this video. If you like this video, I'll be back in the future with more book reviews. Until then, farewell.